Have you ever thought about using ballistic gelatin to test your bullets, test your reloads, anything like that? Well, I have, and some years ago, I concocted my own ballistic gelatin using a lot of Knox gelatin, and that worked okay. The problem with it is you got to keep that stuff pretty cold, otherwise it wants to start to melt on you. And after a few rounds, it's kind of done. And it's not free or cheap either. But what I've done most recently is I've purchased or invested in Clear Ballistics synthetic gelatin. Now I say invested because this stuff isn't cheap or free or inexpensive either. It is about $200, getting close to $200 a block. And what I've purchased is this. This is the box that it comes in. This is a 16 by 6 by 6 gel block. I purchased the NATO 20% gel block. Really, I purchased that because while it is a bit more expensive, I wanted to use this gelatin more so for rifle rounds, and I figured, and correctly so, it would help stop those rifle rounds a little bit better than the 10% ballistic gelatin would. That's called the FBI block. Now, it's not going to stop it in half the distance, 10% versus 20%. That's not what that's all about. But it will stop the bullets slightly faster in a 20% more dense ballistic gelatin than it would in a 10% ballistic gelatin. And by the way, there's been a lot of discussion that I've seen where people have concerns about the synthetic gelatin not being exactly the same as previous or older tests that were done in true ballistic gelatin. That might be the case. However, I'm not so sure of that. I actually went back to some of my old real ballistic gelatin work, and the same type of bullet, in fact the same reloads that I have been using with the same powder charges and all this, and it pretty much came out to be the same end result. About 8.5 inches of penetration in this block versus about 8.5 inches of penetration in the real ballistic gelatin block, using Hornady XTP bullets fired out of a .45 ACP. So I think overall it's pretty darn similar, but it may not be exactly the same. Maybe the best way to approach this is just to understand that the test that you're going to get is somewhat relative. It's going to tell you what that bullet did in this particular instance, in that particular gel block. And still some really, really good information, especially if you see that that bullet is shedding its jacket, it's fragmenting, those sorts of things. Lets you know that that bullet may not be the star bullet that you want to use for hunting and those sorts of things. Anyway, I call this an investment. It really is about $170, $180. You're going to get to close to $200 once this stuff ships, though. And by the way, I just went out to the Clear Ballistics website to check on prices for this video, and I see that they're running a 50% off fall sale. And so I picked up another block of 20% NATO gelatin, 16 by 6 by 6 inches. And with shipping, my order was just over $100. Okay, so we have our ballistic gelatin. It has arrived. Let's say, by the way, this stuff is somewhat heavy. It's about 16, 17 pounds per block. You're going to have inside of each block, you're going to have a card, essentially a certificate of authenticity, or the fact that It has been tested and it complies with those NATO standards. I really like this. I can compare my two blocks and they are extremely similar. Penetration in both cases was 1.6 inches for this steel BB test that they use. Now, some frequently asked questions, or certainly things that were on my mind before I purchased this stuff, was, how many rounds can I actually get out of a block before I need to remelt it? And what I have found is that you can get at maximum 4 rounds, 4 bullets fired into each of these blocks before they really need to be remelted. Now, consider this, that the most consistent test you're going to get, or maybe we'll say the best test, is 1 bullet fired into that block, and then that bullet is pulled out, the block is remelted, and so on and so forth. A second bullet could be fired into it, and sometimes based on how deep that bullet penetrated, the first bullet penetrated, you might be able to just flip the block end to end and fire another one in from the opposite end and have a very good test in that way as well. So in some ways, the number of shots that you can put into a block is going to be related to or dependent upon your shot placement. If you can place maybe 1 round in each of the 4 corners, maybe 1 round in the center, you might be able to get 5, but you probably aren't going to be quite that lucky to get them exactly where they need to be. So 3, 4 rounds is pretty practical expectation for how many bullets you could put into a block before it needs to be remelted. You should consider the structural integrity of the block when you're thinking about how many bullets you can put into the block before remelting it. And to have good reliability in those results that you're pulling out of the block, the penetration of that bullet into the block, the weight retention of that bullet, and so on and so forth, you want to make sure that that block has good structural integrity when you're doing each of those tests. So certainly bear that in mind when you're thinking about remelting and when you need to remelt. I should also point out that if you're going to be using centerfire high power rifles and you want to test those bullets, you're going to need 2 blocks, at least 2 blocks, that you're going to place end to end for that test. And in fact, the .308 Winchester 165 grain Barnes bullets that I tested went through both of those ballistic gel blocks and ended up in a sand trap that I purposely placed out at the end just in case the bullet did exactly what it did. And so I was still able to retrieve that bullet and make some meaningful comparisons from it relative to other bullets that didn't quite make it all the way through 2 blocks. The other thing to understand is that when you hit it with a pretty powerful rifle, that gel is probably going to jump up into the air, and when it comes back down, it may not stay on the platform or table where it started. In fact, twice now the ballistic block fell off of the table, and the first time it landed in the dirt, and the second time it landed on a clean tarp that I used just in case it did that. At about $100 to $200 per block, it matters if you get it on sale or not, this stuff is certainly not disposable, at least not immediately disposable. So you're going to want to remelt this stuff. And remelting might sound pretty darn simple. Just melt it and pop it out of the mold and you're done, ready to shoot again. Well, not quite so straightforward. First of all, you're going to need a mold, and this is the mold that I purchased from Clear Ballistics. I think it ran me about $70 for this thing. It works great. It's pretty hefty, and so I like that. And I have now remelted my blocks 4 times. And what I'd like to share with you is some tips on remelting. First of all, I noticed that this stuff is pretty darn tough. You just don't start plucking off little pieces. It's pretty tough stuff. It's going to take some doing. And I started wearing just some nitrile gloves to give me a little bit better grip on those things or on the gel. And one of the other tips I wanted to share is that I like to cut the block into about 1-inch slices. And I'll use a hacksaw, a meat saw, to cut it in about a 1-inch slice, and then I'll tear it off into small chunks. I like to get these to relatively small chunks, about the size of an ice cube or fairly smaller than an ice cube, because it melts all the better in smaller chunks, and that's all about surface area to volume ratio. So I'm using essentially a Nesco turkey roaster. I'm preheating it for about 15 minutes at that 250 degree point. I do have a separate thermometer that I use with the probe sitting underneath that lid to make sure I'm at about 250 degrees. Some of those, the roaster at least that I have, that little knob really is kind of off. 250 degrees on the knob really is not 250 degrees internally. We want to keep it at about 250 degrees throughout the entire process, and the remelting instruction suggests about 4 hours is required to remelt a block. And all the times I've done this, the 4 times that I've done this, I've never even come close to 4 hours. In fact, if you're going to do this, you should plan about 10 to 12 hours going to be spent taking care of this thing. There's no reason to have it all torn up into small pieces beforehand. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes. It'll take me to completely tear up one of these blocks, maybe 30 minutes if I'm really trying to get them quite small. You don't have to get them tiny, each of little chunks. But figure about half an hour. But again, you don't have to do that ahead of time. Just get enough of them torn up to get the whole process started. And then as it's melting, you can tear up some more and then keep adding it in. And that's what I like to do, is I'll do a preheat, about 15 minutes. Then I'll add 1 layer of the gel chunks. Keep it all closed up as much as possible. Don't keep opening the lid every 15 minutes or so. That really rapidly cools these things off. And as it starts melting and you cannot really see individual chunks in there anymore, throw in another layer, close it up, maybe another half an hour, 45 minutes, you're going to come back, check it again, throw in another layer, and continue that process until you get everything melted. And then the next step is really waiting to get all those bubbles out. And that's just a slower process where those bubbles will just either rise to the surface or they'll just pop internally and kind of smooth out nicely. If you leave a bunch of bubbles in it, number one, it's not really the end of the world, but you are changing the structural integrity of that block because you now have those air bubbles inside the block. So you really want to try to get those things out. But once it's all melted, you don't have hardly any bubbles left internally. There will probably be some on top. That's okay. Then you just let it cool. I let it cool overnight, and then I remove it from the mold. Now, removing it from the mold isn't something terribly simple either, but I do have a trick for this that I learned from the folks at Clear Ballistics, and that is to employ the use of an air hose to really help loosen things up. I have an entire video just showing that quick 2-minute process, and it really makes removing the gel from the block super, super simple. Now, as you're handling that gel block, it's going to kind of get smudged up. It'll get smudged up worse if you're just using your bare hands. If you're using, again, something like those nitrile gloves, it doesn't get smudged up quite as bad, but it'll still get smudged up. And it won't be quite as crystal clear as you might like. So what I've been doing is I've been applying a heat gun to it. And this I also learned from others online as well as from the folks at Clear Ballistics. And this is a Bauer heat gun. You get these from Harbor Freight. This one cost me, I think, about 20 bucks, maybe 30 bucks. And I chose this one because it has quite a number of heat settings and it can get tremendously hot. But I really like the fact that I can simply place it on a table, my workbench, while I might be moving the block around, and it stands up perfectly fine just like this. This tip gets very hot, as you can imagine. I don't want it laying down and touching other things necessarily. So I really like that little feature. Works out really well. And to clean up the exterior smudges, this thing does a fantastic job. Don't try to do it with your home hair dryer. It just doesn't produce enough heat to make the block nice and clear. Now understand that over time the block is going to become a little bit more opaque and a little bit more opaque. It will not stay crystal clear forever. Even if it never falls in the dirt or anything like that, there is going to be some stuff that comes off of those bullets, especially rifle bullets, it seems like, that's going to start making the block dirty. And what I've tried to do is I'll try to pick away that black stuff and just throw it away. I'll just throw it away. I'll try to keep the block as clean as possible. When it fell into the dirt, I literally washed it off as well as I could, and then I really, really dried it. I was told you don't want water in the remelting process. You want absolutely dry chunks of this gel. But over time, it's going to darken. It's going to become less transparent. And now here is my block after 4 remeltings and being shot again, and that is not quite crystal clear anymore. Certainly not compared to what it used to look like. I can probably get, this has got 2 rounds into it, I can probably get another round, maybe 2 more rounds, probably for sure 1 more round into it, and then I'm going to have to chop it up and remelt it once again. If it's a huge thing for you that you be able to see everything perfectly, and that sure is cool, sure is nice to be able to do that, well then plan on getting rid of the block a little bit earlier. I think it still has all the structural integrity necessary to yield a good test, but certainly it's not crystal clear. Well, there we have it. A few tips I wanted to share with you about Clear Ballistics, Ballistic Gelatin. Fun stuff, very informative, really tells you what your bullet's doing. And now you know how to take care of it with remelting, removing it from the mold, and keeping it as clear as possible with a little bit of a heat gun application. Thanks for watching, and take care.